Hello, in this particular video, I want to continue the series I started before, talking about Baudrillard in the context of space privatization. I really think that Baudrillard has a lot to say in the context of space privatization because, like I said in the intro, I think that a lot of the arguments that Baudrillard makes about the particular effects of cultural images and the way that it produces a particular symbolic relationship to the world and how it kind of gears our political action as well as our regular subjective action is really interesting for the context of the space resolution, because I feel like so much of the space resolution is already kind of dictated or confined to its ability, its imaginative ability that's really geared in past kind of images of the Cold War, combined with argumentation, combined with different kinds of ideas about the role that things like science fiction and new imaginations about science and technology really play into the way in which we're relating to the world. And so I think there are a lot of really interesting arguments to be made in terms of what Baudrillard is really saying about a lot of these contexts and what the way it kind of reflects on the various effects of different affirmatives and just the ethos of the resolution as a whole. And so in this video, I kind of want to continue down that path as we talk a little bit about Baudrillard on the negative versus policy teams. I definitely think that this is a legitimate strategy against a lot of policy teams, because I think that a lot of the kind of the arguments that a lot of what I think policy teams really thrive off in this context is the ability to kind of win that the kind of possibility of space to be used for common good, or the possibility of stopping humanity from dying from extinction because of some of the dangers of space kind of represent the necessity for us to kind of have an inevitable relationship to space development, even if it's not one that should come through privatization. I think that this is a really interesting way to frame what the consequence of the resolution is, or how we should be looking at it, because I think that there are a lot of really good arguments for Baudrillard to read on the negative. And so I kind of want to start just talking about what are the priorities for how you should be framing the debate. I think that that the first thing is that a lot of the arguments that you really need to make a tie to is that cultural imagery, the way that we study things, the way that we talk about things, is important for our relationship to how we're able to think about what the simulation is, and whether or not that we should kind of be ontologizing our relationship to the status quo and the way society exists right now. I feel one of the hardest things for Baudrillard teams to overcome, and a lot of the things that you'll kind of need to overcome first in order to really make this criticism viable, is being able to win that there's a kind of significant impact from our ability to stay in the way in which the world is functioning now. And it is something that ultimately drives us towards our own destruction. I definitely think that there are a lot of arguments to be made for in the context of why this is true in space. I feel you can make arguments about how space imagery, science fiction, etc. has made it justifiable and commonplace for humans to be able to think about the idea of being able to sacrifice in the name of common good in order to move to space, and why that has ultimately ended up in the accumulation of resources for the context of the development of space, whether it be through forces of colonization, various types of extraction, or other forms of structural violence that have ultimately kind of ontologized the way in which we're already thinking about colonialism in other perspectives as kind of eventual and necessary for a particular the sustainability of our society. And then also I think there are a lot of arguments to make in terms of why debate, in particular academic spaces, are also really important to the political and kind of active framing of how we think about space, because of how intimately tied studies of science and technology are to what we think of as professional understandings of how we should be thinking about and relating to the concept of space, because it's something that and even in terms of astronomy is a field of study, it's something that is being discovered in progress, but isn't something that is necessarily finalized. And so a lot of arguments being made about why the academy, the way that we talk about, think about space, actually does translate into factual interpretations of how we're able to interpret what our relationship should be towards space and how we should be acting towards it politically and culturally. This is even true in the context of nonfiction pieces, the context of science fiction. And I think there are a lot of arguments to play with the concept of how fiat resides in these things, and how its conclusion in the context of politics basically kind of mimics the way in which the state is kind of operationalizing things like science fiction in order to kind of ontologize or make kind of inevitable and permanent the ability for there to be this kind of inevitable sacrifice for the general public gain towards space, even if it means some going beyond just a refusal of privatized space as something that is naturally bad. I then think that there are a lot of arguments to go for in the context of the framing portion and the thesis portion of the debate, where you're able to start thinking about what you should be doing at a top level. I think that the first thing is that I think a lot of your framing arguments should have really good indites of the way in which fiat and just the kind of relationship the debate has towards the production of science fiction or culturally relevant images in the context of space as a whole. I think there are a lot of arguments to be made about how space, if they're right about the way in which it kind of relates to the public as such, a part of a key important part of the way in which the public is thinking about its role, then it's also true that the kind of conversations that we have and the way that we think about the role that science technology plays, and particularly the way in which fiat is able to kind of create theorizations of those things that may not exist yet are ones in which play a similar role in which like science fiction does. And so I feel like there are a lot of arguments in terms of like testing like what this does in terms of its pertinence to like how we frame ourselves as society in the way that it justifies violence in the name of humanity. And I feel like a lot of the framing arguments that you can make from there is like why kind of basing off solvency or offense based off of like the fiated gains of the 1AC already presume that like the imagery of the 1AC is something that isn't like something that kind of like feeds like a lot of the kind of like violence that you're talking about at a top level that comes with science fiction, and also that doesn't like kind of like repeat and mimic the same type of like forces that kind of like made the Cold War space race one that like was imbued with violence, or that created and made inevitable things like the Challenger disaster. So you can make arguments, for instance, about why things like fiats, etc., kind of like play into like serial policy reform at like a top level, which I think is like something like really useful in terms of like starting to gut the value of like why debating about like the 1AC at all is good or bad. And then I feel like when you like transition a lot of this advice into what you should be doing at a thesis level, a lot of it translates into like what is the best way for you to be able to use some of this top level indite of just like what the kind of like framing of the 1AC is, and start making arguments about why the particular content that is in the 1AC is the same as that which is kind of like producing like how we're already related towards space in such a way that is like able to continually justify the sacrificing of particular like vulnerable populations or vulnerable bodies in the name of being able to like produce some type of value that is able to kind of like recuperate like all of the things that are being lost, or that is able to kind of like allow for this idea of like human survivability beyond like human capabilities, which then allows us to like basically be imbued with the idea that like humans have this like inevitable nature that they have to survive, etc., and all these things, which does make it easier for us to like throw away those that are like not strong enough to survive, those that need to be sacrificed in order for there to be progress in the context of the humanity. And so then you have a lot of arguments to be made about why the overall value of like what the 1AC is doing, even if it kind of critiques privatization as this like capitalistic force that is kind of like bad for the overall health of what space does in particular public commons, allows you to make arguments about why at a form level it kind of like mimics the same process instead of power relations, but in the context of the public sphere, which isn't like better because of the way in which it like is able to operationalize images of like science and technological ascension, that thus is able to kind of like fortify like why like things like white humanity and other kind of like structural factors are kind of like the necessary like models of development that are kind of like put next to other kind of like less developed nations that are inability to like operationalize or access such as a space force, and thus kind of like replays a lot of the kind of like power relations that we're seeing on Earth at like a spatial context, which I think are all relevant for a lot of the arguments that we're kind of going to be making later on, which will be hopefully much more specific to the app in the next video that we'll be doing. But hopefully you enjoyed this one, and you'll keep watching all of the stuff that I'll be doing with Baudrillard, space privatization, and other LD concepts. And yeah, thank you so much for tuning in.